Thank you all for joining us, and welcome to the Center for Water Efficient Landscaping's very first virtual field day. We're going to break up the next couple of hours into 3 different rounds, with each round consisting of a series of short videos summarizing projects that we would normally be walking you through in person. Each of these 3 rounds will be followed up with a 5-minute Q&A session. For the first round, we have Paul Harris, Kelly Cope, Paige Boyle, and Paul Johnson sharing projects that they have been working on out at Greenville Farm in Logan, Utah. Enjoy! Up first, we have Paul Harris giving us a tour of Greenville Farm.
So we're looking at a bird's eye view of the Greenville Research Farm. My area of expertise is managing the turfgrass research in the native ornamentals. Right now we're looking at about 7 acres of turfgrass research. And it looks pretty cool up in the air. You can see probably 1,000 different varieties of turfgrass. I won't name all of them. That would take forever. They're all in various stages of establishment, data collection, and after about 3 to 5 years we'll turn a study over, or we'll spray it out and then renovate that plot for upcoming research. Here, coming into your screen on the bottom, we have our NTEP putting green. The National Turfgrass Evaluation Program is sponsoring this study. That area of the farm usually takes up the most amount of our time. Not necessarily because we don't necessarily take a lot of data from it, but just the upkeep involved with maintaining the putting green is fairly intense. We're mowing it 3 times a week, and on top of that there's, frequent fertilizer applications, verticutting, top dressing, aeration, just things that typical golf courses need to do to maintain their putting greens in a healthy, playable way. Now we're kind of swinging over to the northern part of the farm, where a while back, several years ago, that was an eddy covariance study where they needed 4 acres of turfgrass to collect their data, and that study just kind of stayed there. We use it for other research. Right now there's research involving different irrigation cycles to see if night irrigation versus day irrigation, if there's a difference between the two. Looking out over the farm, as we head a little bit further west, we can kind of see what looks like a whole bunch of little army tents, but those are actually, bug tents. There's insect research involving spider mites on silage, so that's one of the interesting things that we get to be a part of just a lot of different research projects. A lot's going on. Kind of up here right there that looks like a dead plot, that's an alfalfa field that was just barely harvested. There's a study there involving Roundup resistance. We also see that green patch right there that's in the middle of the screen. That's also an insect study. And then as we fly over closer toward these hoop houses, there's a lot of research involved. Cut flowers, raspberries. Also in that area we do see asparagus. And way up, kind of in the corner there on 8th East and 1800 North, is our native ornamental research, where a lot's happening there with drought tolerance and basically looking at ornamentals that will do well in our climate. And there you have it, there's Greenville Farm.
We have Paul again walking us through the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program's Creeping Bentgrass study.
Hi everyone, my name's Paul Harris. I'm a research technician for the Center for Water Efficient Landscaping, and we're going to do our best to try to show you grass. So right here we're on our NTEP putting green, and we're at the end of a 5-year study where we've looked at about 20 different varieties of creeping bentgrass, and we've monitored these grasses in typical, not high water use, but standard water use, and as well as low water use. So if you were here in person, you could kind of walk through and easily tell which one is which. We see a lot of dry, localized dry spots in this low irrigation, whereas the other half is typical irrigation. And over the course of this study, we've collected data on visual quality, genetic color, those sort of things. And so there's 2 treatments with this study. We're looking at low water applications and typical irrigation applications. And for the most part during this study, we didn't see a whole lot of difference between the two applications. We concluded that you can effectively maintain creeping bentgrass putting greens with about 60% ET replacement. And what that means is the evapotranspiration that occurs throughout the day. Say we need to replace 1 inch of water, which is a lot. We only need to replace 60% of that, or 0.6 of an inch. So that's what 60% replacement means. And like I said, we didn't see a whole lot of differences between the two water treatments until there was some sort of irrigation dry down, or something happened where we weren't able to deliver irrigation properly. And usually that happens when we see like a clogged filter in our system, and so the sprinklers won't run at full capacity, or we have a really windy night, so there's a lot of drift and the water doesn't hit its target like it typically does. In that case, the treatments, the low water treatments, had a longer recovery time. And because it's science and we can't, baby this like we typically would a putting green on the golf course, we kind of just have to let it die and then kind of struggle to let it survive, I guess. So that was the biggest difference between the two treatments, is the recovery period whenever we did see some sort of, dry down event, or we had some localized dry spot appear. As far as, spring green up, they were both about the same. They both kind of came out of dormancy at the same time. And usually once cooler temperatures arrived in the fall, in September, October, we would notice that the low water use treatment would kind of catch up to the typical water use treatment. One of the observations that we noticed is just amongst the different cultivars of the creeping bentgrass is we have a lot of varieties that are what they call in the industry is kind of improved varieties. So they're kind of bred to have a tighter canopy, so you have less disruption, I guess, as the ball rolls. But those varieties also tend to be a little bit more thatchy. And what we've noticed is these more thatchy varieties, they would be most likely to develop these localized dry spots or hydrophobic areas. And you can tell, we had a dry down event a couple of weeks ago where there's a glitch with the irrigation system and we weren't able to irrigate. And you could almost tell exactly which varieties were affected the most by it. And if you were with me, you could come through and, step on, each one of the varieties, and you can tell which ones are, spongy, what we'd call it, and other ones that are a little bit more firm. And we found that the older varieties that have been around for decades were the ones that were least susceptible for localized dry spot. They were least thatchy. Even though they weren't the prettiest, but they still were able to avoid, too many dead spots from these dry down events. One thing I do want to point out, just the nature of this study. In our other studies, we'll go through and we'll actually kill the edges of the plots with Roundup so we can, keep them from expanding into the other plots. But these ones we put nails in the ground, and that just helps us identify where one variety stops and the other begins. And over the time, we've noticed that the ones that are a little bit, the least competitive ones will actually shrink. You can see that, well, I don't know if you can see, because I've been looking at this for the last 5 years, but this one's kind of bled into this plot a little bit. This is kind of one of the older varieties that's not as competitive, and we're seeing it start to shrink. And over the course of, maybe 10 or 15 years, that'd probably disappear altogether. And if you're on an older golf course, you might see something similar where you see kind of patches of different colors of bent grass. That's what's happening in those areas. So it's been a fun study to work on. Although it is very time consuming, I'm excited to spray it with Roundup tomorrow.
This is our final video of Paul as he walks us through the National Turfgrass Evaluations Program's Cool Season Water Use Study.
So the plot that we're looking at here is the Cool Season NTEP Water Use Study, which Dr. Johnson's already explained that NTEP is the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program. And one of the common things that we see with all of our research projects here is that we enjoy almost killing the grass and then bringing it back to life. So This study here, we're looking at 3 different irrigation treatments. We're looking at an 80% irrigation return, 60% and 40%. And what we're doing with this project is we're basically hand watering this entire thing. From our weather station here on the farm, we can calculate or retrieve that ET data, and from there make calculations on how much water we need to replace onto these plots. And then 3 times a week, the students will go around and hand water this. If you have a good audio book, this is a perfect study to work on with. But usually June 1st is when we started treatments, and then this goes for 10 weeks, and then we start to return normal irrigation right around September. And some of the observations, we don't do it justice right now because everything looks good, but some of the observations that we've noticed is that we can still see good turf at 60% ET irrigation. We're looking at mainly 2 different types of grass. We're looking at Kentucky Bluegrass and tall fescue. And the Kentucky Bluegrass is a little bit more sensitive to drought stress than the tall fescue is. So what we've observed is earlier on, the Kentucky Bluegrass will tend to go dormant quicker, where the tall fescue will kind of hang on to its turf quality a little bit longer. However, when we get into the recovery phase, the Kentucky Bluegrass will recover quite a bit faster than the tall fescue. So these tall fescue and Kentucky Bluegrass varieties, they're just standard varieties. Some of them are experimental varieties from different seed growers, and some are commercial varieties that you can find at Home Depot or any seed supplier. But yeah, studies like this are meant for the home lawn, your city parks or athletic fields. They're meant to be used and played on, stressed out. Another thing we did notice is the first year we did this, we didn't treat for bill bugs, and the damage to the bill bugs, no matter what the treatment is, we saw huge declines in turf quality. Even with the 80% irrigation return, we saw that the damage that the bill bugs did to the turf was far more than what the drought could do. And no matter how much water you put on, you still couldn't mask that damage from the bill bugs. So since then, we've begun treating for bill bugs because we want to see how well it does with the drought conditions and not necessarily the insect damage, because insect damage is something that, or insect control is something that we can do fairly easy in Utah with preventative treatments for things like bill bugs. But it's another one of those studies, like I mentioned on the putting green, where we're spending a lot of time on the putting green. We're almost spending just as much time on this one with weekly visual quality ratings. We take digital images that we can use once a week to find percent green cover. So this is a fairly busy plot in the summer. Right now we're moving sprinklers around to make way for future studies, but this is a fun plot to look at in the middle of July when we can see definite differences in the irrigation treatment.
Up next, we have Kelly Cope walking us through the Wi-Fi based irrigation controller study.
Hi, I'm Kelly Cope. I am the director of the Center for Water Efficient Landscaping here at Utah State University, and I'm here today to talk with you about a research project that was recently completed here at the Greenville Farm in Logan, Utah. And this project was initiated in 2018 by then master's student Shane Evans, now master's graduate Shane Evans, who has since moved on. And so that's the reason that I'm going to be sharing some of the results of that project with you today. But before I share those results with you, I want to describe what we were doing here. And what you see behind me are 20 different plots that include both areas of turfgrass, and they also include areas of ornamental plants. And in the case of the turf grasses, these are irrigated with overhead spray type irrigation. And in the case of the ornamental plants, they are irrigated with drip irrigation. And so the idea here was to evaluate different Wi-Fi enabled irrigation controllers to see how they may have differed in terms of water application, and also to see how plant health was affected during their use. So the project ran in 2018 and in 2019, and we tested 3 different Wi-Fi enabled controllers: the Orbit Beehive controller, the Ratio controller, and also the SkyDrop controller, all of which have been rebated by the state of Utah for purchase at one time or another. And so we utilize those controllers on these plots, as well as a standard controller that we programmed by hand. And we monitored water application over the 2-year period, as well as a number of different plant health aspects, including things like percent green cover for the turfgrass canopy or leaf temperature, to try to see if differences in water application resulted in effects on plant health. So, to share some of those results with you, I had to make a couple of notes because there are a few numbers here I wanted to be sure that I got correct. What we found was that the Wi-Fi enabled controllers, all of them, were able to save water as compared to the amount of water that a typical Utah homeowner applies. So, for example, based on years of doing irrigation system evaluations in the state, we know that the typical homeowner applies about 48 inches of irrigation water annually. The Orbit Beehive and Ratio controllers applied about 34 inches of water annually, so a decrease from the 48. And the SkyDrop controller applied 22 inches of water per year, which really approximated what we were measuring out here at the farm in terms of evapotranspiration. It was very, very close. In addition, we found that the Hunter controller, the one that we program manually, also applied about 22 inches of water per year. So lots of interesting things going on. The takeaways, I would say, are that in all cases the Wi-Fi enabled controllers did save water as compared to the typical homeowner. However, the manually programmed controller also saved a significant amount of water, and that was following our typical USU extension recommendations for irrigation timing and frequency. So positive findings in all cases. I think I would say that Wi-Fi enabled controllers are great solutions for folks, especially if they're into technology. It can help them save water. But I would also say that if that's not possible or doable for folks, they can also save water by programming their manual controller appropriately.
And here's Kelly covering the low input turf trials.
So I'm standing here in the middle of one of the many turfgrass trialing programs we have here at the Greenville farm. And this particular trial is put on by the Alliance for Low Input Sustainable Turf. And you can probably guess just by taking a look around that this is indeed a low input research project. For example, fungicide only is applied during establishment, same with herbicide, and after that, neither of those are ever applied again during the course of the study. Another really important aspect of this particular trial is that these plots receive a minimal amount of fertilization. So they receive 1.5 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet during establishment, and then after that they're maintained with 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year. So that is really a minimal amount of fertilization. In addition, during the course of the summer, once things really get hot, around July 1st, we actually stop irrigation. And so these plots will change significantly from what you see here today. But this is one example of the types of trialing that we do here at the farm. So these plots are with the Alliance for Low Input Sustainable Turfgrass, but we also participate in a number of other trialing programs, and some of my colleagues will have talked about the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program. However, we also participate in a different program called the Turfgrass Water Conservation Alliance Program, where we trial proven varieties that are meant to save at least 30% in terms of water application over the course of the growing season. And so we participate in many, many trialing programs here. The idea being that we can work with and identify and demonstrate varieties of turf grasses that either are low input in every way, such as these plots, or low input in other ways, namely water, which is of course a huge focus.
Our 6th video in this series is Kelly Cope covering the Jacqueline seed trial.
Okay, so I'm standing here in the middle of another trial. This one is sponsored by a private company, Jacqueline Seed, and it's similar in that we have plots of different varieties of, in this case, Kentucky Bluegrass, and we establish them and monitor them over a period of at least 2 years and see how they do in terms of color, quality, establishment, etc. And so this is the last year that this study will be going on, and then we provide that information to the sponsor.
Up next, we have Kelly showing us how turf trials are evaluated using a light box.
Okay, so one of the ways that we evaluate our trials is to use digital imagery. And what you see here is our employee Lizzie taking digital images of the area underneath that silver box. And there are actually lights underneath that box that create a consistent lighting situation as she moves across the plots. And so we can take those digital images back to our lab and load them on the computer and use some software to analyze those to determine and quantify differences among all of the various varieties that we are testing, the species that we are testing, etc. So this is the main way that we evaluate those differences.
Video number 9 discusses eco-lawns in the Intermountain West with Paige Boyle.
Hi guys, my name is Paige Boyle. I'm a PhD student here at USU, and I'm doing a clover study, so a low input system study, and we are looking at white clover, rose clover, crimson clover, and strawberry clover. And the goal is to see if they persist in Kentucky bluegrass and how they react to fertilization. So we have all of those clovers grown with Kentucky bluegrass. Half of them will receive 2 pounds of nitrogen per year, and the other half will be unfertilized. And we're going to see kind of how they react to weed encroachment, if they persist under fertilization, if they persist with the bluegrass in general. And so that's kind of the idea. We just seeded, so there's not too much to look at right now, but we're hoping to kind of look at that over the next 2 years.
Our final 2 videos are with Paul Johnson. Up first, he's going to cover turfgrass species and variety trials in response to drought and insect pests.
I'm Paul Johnson, and I'm a professor in the CWEL group studying and doing research with the turf grasses. And I'd like to show you the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program Cool Season Low Input Trial, a long title for a fairly small plot. This is really a test for the ultra low maintenance. What things can survive with no fertilizer, no weed control, but most importantly, no irrigation. This plot has been in for about 4 years now, and I'll show you a few of the varieties or the species that have done well year after year and those that have not. In general, the best adapted for these kind of conditions are the wheat grasses. We have this one right here. It's an intermediate wheatgrass, usually used for rangelands, but it can be a good turf under these kind of conditions. It will go dormant early in the summer, but then survive year after year. There are two other wheat grasses. The crested wheatgrass, not quite as thick, but it does tend to survive very well. This does have some clover mixed in here. It came in from another plot. And then if you want to come over here, this one here is a stream bank wheatgrass, well adapted in our area, Not as high a quality as that intermediate wheatgrass, but will survive and compete well with weeds. If you kind of look around, you can see the plots that survive the best, have the best cover. They don't have many weeds. This one right here obviously is not doing well and is full of weeds. So that's kind of the indicator of what really is surviving year after year. We do have some of the more traditional turf grasses in here also, and the best one of those is probably the tall are the tall fescue entries. This one here is a Kentucky 31, standard kind of a forage type, but does survive in our location here because it can root very deeply and survive well, and not have any irrigation. There are other tall fescues that range from good, like this one here, has a better color, but not quite as thick as a Kentucky 31. Other tall fescues have not done as well as the one right here. The Kentucky bluegrasses did survive well for about the first year or two, but now really only one of the Kentucky blues are really keeping their stand. And this one right here is the old variety Ken Blue. It does keep a reasonable stand after this amount of time. But the fine fescues, these in front here, really have not survived well. They lose a lot of their stand, they get clumpy, and then as a result, they tend to have a lot of weeds that are coming in now. We have a kind of an unusual entry in this one trial too. It's a yarrow, typical yarrow you might find in your landscape, but it was a variety selected to be used as a turf. This one actually retains green color the best of all of these other entries long into the summertime. I'd like to look at how well it can tolerate traffic, but it does keep a good cover. It competes well with weeds and looks reasonably good. This trial we will have in for the next, say, 2 years, and we'll continue to study these and evaluate these and give recommendations on what can really be a truly no maintenance a turf in our state.
In our final video, Paul's going to cover the NTEP Kentucky Bluegrass trial.
Show you a few things on the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program Kentucky Bluegrass trial. This is a variety trial of about 85 Kentucky bluegrass entries. We've had this plot in since the fall of 2017, and it's a lower water. It's a drought trial in that we irrigate this plot at significantly less than what most homeowners or golf course superintendents or athletic field managers would do. We irrigate this at about 60% of the ET rate compared to about 80% in a lot of other places. What that really does is it selects out, or it shows some of the impacts of insects, and primarily here a very damaging insect to the Kentucky to the Kentucky bluegrasses is the bluegrass billbug species. and that they feed from the early in the early summer on the roots of the turf grasses, and that really gets aggravated or shows up a lot more when the grasses are under drought stress. You can see kind of the result of that. We had significant damage last year in this plot, especially in this region right here. But you can see which varieties tended to either resist or tolerate that better. Those that have a good full stand now either resisted or recovered well from that, while these other varieties tended to really get hit hard, have some significant kill, and didn't come back as well last fall and this spring. We see a few different patterns. Those varieties that tend to go dormant quickly tolerate or resist the damage better, in that the insects don't seem to feed as much on them, and so they come back just fine. They go dormant quickly, and then they'll come back quickly in the fall. Those that try to stay green or remain green longer into the season and resist going dormant more tend to be susceptible to a lot of the damage. You can also see the big range in color. We have very dark green varieties, all scattered into a very light green varieties, and then everything in between. I think that's one of the most fascinating things about Kentucky bluegrass, is just that range of color that we see, range of habits, the range of leaf textures. It's a very diverse species. I do want to, though, mention that there are a few fine fescue plots scattered within as well. Those really stood out last summer because they didn't get affected by the billbug damage. So this plot has really seen that drought stress for 1 year, and we'll keep this under these conditions for another 3 years, and both on this plot and on the other plots, you can see all the data on the NTEP website, and that's ntep.org, and you can see what the data is here in Utah, as well as elsewhere around the country.
Okay, let's wrap up this round with a 5-minute question and answer session with our 4 presenters. It's a lot easier for us to keep track of questions if they're typed in the Q&A box versus the chat box. So if y'all would please type your questions into the Q&A box, it would be very much appreciated. If we have more questions coming in than we're able to get to during the next 5 minutes, don't worry, all of the presenters are going to stick around and be live at the end of the field day to answer any remaining or additional questions that come in.